Mutta nyt sitten todellakin suoraan Floridasta tohtori Paul Clayton. Dr. Paul Clayton, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. We will not take your stage time more. We are now happy to hear your analysis of the current situation of the whole world.
The whole world. Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about health matters mostly, and as the title shows, diet and disease, and to a limited extent, doctors. And doctors are really only marginally involved in diet and disease. They don't have much to contribute, frankly, because they don't have any tools that they can use to address the growing problems with our public health system. We know that every nation that goes through what is called the nutrition transition, when they move from a traditional diet to a modern ultra-processed diet, there are multiple explosions of degenerative disease. And frankly, the medical profession, with its reliance on pharmaceutical tools, has been unable to do anything about this worsening of our public health. But there are ways in which we can address it. I want to justify this, I claim that the doctors haven't done anything, by simply looking at where public health is today. I'll look at a few countries. Australia. We think of them as healthy, but according to the government's own figures, a half of all adult Australians have one chronic degenerative disease, and a quarter have two or more. The other side of the world, Denmark, it's really the same situation. And you can see that as you go through the different age groups from 16 to 44 to middle age to old age, the numbers of degenerative diseases increase. And you think of that as being part and parcel of the normal process of aging. Believe me, it's not. You don't have to get sicker as you get older. America's the same. About almost 2/3 of adults there have a chronic degenerative disease, and 40% of two or more. Half of all older adults have three or more. It's a very sick society, and all the trends are negative. Not just in the United States, but all over the world. All over the world, we're becoming heavier. And along with that, NIDDM, type 2 diabetes, has been increasing everywhere. And that shortens your life. And all of the complications of diabetes and metabolic syndrome, all of them are increasing. And the key to this problem is, not only do we see frequency increasing, that is, the numbers of people with these conditions are increasing, but latency is decreasing. That is, the age at which people are developing these diseases is getting younger and younger and younger. And this is the sign of a deeply sick culture, and it is actually the sign of a culture that is being poisoned. I'll go show you some more evidence. Dementias have increased dramatically. The average age of dementia has fallen by 15 years since 1980, which is not very long ago, which means that more people are dying of these neurodegenerative disease. Depression, doubling with each generation. And that's a problem because depression, a history of depressive illness, increases the risk of dementia in later life. So already this enormous problem, which is crashing healthcare budgets everywhere, is clearly going to get worse. And we know it's going to get worse for other reasons as well, because we're getting heavier, there's more overweight and obesity, and that is another major risk factor. Something's damaging our brains at the older ages, towards the end of life. It's also damaging our brains at the beginnings of life. You can see here that ADD, ADHD, the spectrum disorders have also shown a dramatic increase. Let's look at conditions that affect the musculoskeletal system. Osteoporosis increasing, osteoarthritis, all kinds of problems with cartilage, partly because we're getting heavier, but there's evidence of a deterioration in cartilage chemistry as well. Now let's jump across to diseases affecting the immune system. Everybody knows that asthma has increased very, very dramatically, but it's not just asthma. Allergic conjunctivitis, rhinitis, dermatitis, they've all increased as well in the same way. And then there's a group of allergies or allergy-like disorders called eosinophilic gastrointestinal disorders, which you might not be so familiar with. They're increasing in just the same way. Then you have the autoimmune diseases. That's the last item on the slide. Things like rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes. There's many of them, over 100. Very interesting from a medical perspective. They can be pretty awful if you actually have one. But the main point is these are all increasing as well. And so are the cancers. So non-tobacco related cancers, take tobacco out of the equation. Those cancers have doubled. One in particular, non-tobacco related lung cancer, that's doubled since 2012. A very, very rapid, very alarming increase. And it's not because society is getting older. We see the same increase in frequency in cancer in teens and young adults. And again, one cancer in one particular group, bowel cancer, in the group aged 22 to 37-year-olds, that's increased 4 times since 1974. Now, this is from a very highly regarded statistician, and I think we can take it for granted that this trend is real. I will say to you that this is not numerically the most important type of cancer that we see in the hospitals, but the trend, just as it is with non-tobacco related lung cancer, is clear, and it's urgent, and it's really concerning. Could things get worse? Yes, they could, because we're getting more stupid. This meta-analysis is the sum of a lot of different studies which have attempted to measure intelligence in representative groups of people. But since 1950, go to the middle of the slide on the bottom line towards 2020, the data shows that in the last generation, or you might want to think of this as 2 generations, we've lost approximately 15 IQ points. And since 2020, there's been 1 or 2 other little studies, and they seem to show that we're continuing to go down that slide. If any of you have seen the movie Idiocracy, I think you know how that goes. Does it matter? Well, it may not, because we're facing a more existential problem. Our ability to reproduce ourselves is also in sharp decline. So here's a meta-analysis, another group of many studies showing that sperm counts are falling. Since 1970, sperm counts have fallen in the developed nations by almost 2/3. And we're seeing more and more men who are subclinically infertile, borderline infertile, and frankly, they are infertile, along with the problems that you're already more familiar with, I think, with infertility in women. Not only are men becoming less fertile, they're becoming less masculine because testosterone levels are falling. At the same time, there is evidence that testosterone levels may be rising in women, partly due to obesity and polycystic ovary syndrome. There's a kind of endocrinological convergence, which is actually very bad for everybody. What's the cause of it? Well, it's the modern diet. And this is enormous data, the biggest of all the data sets. Poor diet has been very clearly identified as the biggest cause of early death all over the world. And one of the ways in which it kills us is through this system. And this is a diagram of chronic inflammatory stress. And the doctors, the medical scientists, and the biochemists will probably know all about this. And it's, really interesting stuff, which we can have a discussion about, perhaps on another occasion. But for lay people, it's a little bit confusing. So I'm going to show you a simpler version. Excuse me. So here, what you have there is a diagram of a typical cell membrane. Those parallel lines that run across the top of the screen, that's the archetypical cell membrane. And when you see an inflammatory challenge up there in the top left, could be a microbe, could be a physical injury, the body actually needs to mount an inflammatory reaction, an acute inflammatory reaction. This is a very important part of the way in which we defend ourselves against insults. And what happens is, once that inflammatory challenge arises, you start that acute inflammatory reaction with essential fatty acid. It's an omega-6 fatty acid called arachidonic acid. That's over on the left. And that produces pro-inflammatory compounds which start the inflammatory sequence. And then once the threat has been neutralized, the microbe has been killed, the damaged tissue has been removed, along comes the braking system, that's over on the right, EPA and DHA. They're omega-3 fatty acids, and they produce compounds called things like resolvins, protectins, maresins, and they stop the inflammation. You need to have the omega-6s and the omega-3s because we're constantly being challenged. And you need to be able to create that inflammatory response and then stop it once the threat has been neutralized. And you can think of this as like the accelerator and the brake on a car. And if you're driving through the mean streets of Helsinki, there are times when you need the accelerator and there are times that you need the brake, and you need to use them in the right proportions. And that is how it is with us as well. The problem is we have too much accelerator and not enough brake. We have far too much arachidonic acid in our cell membranes and not enough of the EPA and DHA. So we tend to have chronic inflammatory stress. You're constantly driving that inflammatory sequence. You're not stopping it adequately. And because this chronic inflammatory sequence is running out of control and constantly in the background, this leads to progressive tissue damage. So here's another way of looking at it. These are the breakdown products from the omega-6s and omega-3s. And if you're faced with an inflammatory challenge, and if you're eating a modern diet which has far too much omega-6, you are creating these omega-6 derived mediators in the body. They're causing edema, and they're also upregulating a set of genes which code for enzymes called matrix metalloproteases. Now, your immune cells are constantly shedding little particles. We used to call them cell dust. They're now called exosomes, and they're full of mRNA, they're full of enzymes, full of all kinds of information. But if you're eating a modern diet, you're releasing too many of these matrix metalloprotease enzymes, and they cause tissue destruction. In fact, they're so destructive that a healthy diet, a pre-transitional, traditional diet, always has the right 6:3 ratio, and also these compounds called polyphenols. The problem is today we're eating a diet which has far too much omega-6s. The multinational food companies pour those into all of our foods, so that typically, instead of a healthy ratio, which would be 2:1, 3:1, 4:1, in Europe, the average ratio is 15:1. In North America, it's 25:1, which is why that society is so very, very sick, even sicker than ours. So because we have this very high 6:3 ratio, this first phase of the inflammatory sequence is overheating. Now, this is a very simplified version. So to all the doctors and medical scientists, there are many steps between these two phases. This is a simplified version. Now, if you were eating lots of polyphenols, and this is a situation you find in the Far East and in Africa, for example, even with a high 6:3 ratio, you are still going to be probably okay. But if you're living in a developed nation, eating a diet consisting largely of ultra-processed foods, then the next stage of the problem arises, because this kind of diet really takes away the polyphenols as well. They're no longer there to inhibit the matrix metalloprotease enzymes. And a quick note for the scientists, these polyphenols also have the ability to downregulate the genes that express for these very destructive enzymes. So Western diet, high 6:3, not enough polyphenols, so both the top and at the bottom of this inflammatory cascade are overheating, releasing lots and lots of these matrix metalloprotease enzymes, and they're called matrix metalloprotease enzymes because they destroy the extracellular matrix. Now, you've heard of collagen. That's one of the fibers in this matrix, but there's many other fiber types as well, which is why collagen products don't really work. And this is a three-dimensional mesh of microfibers that runs through every cubic micrometer of your body, holding all your cells together in the correct orientation so that they can communicate and function collectively as a tissue and as an organ. But those matrix metalloprotease enzymes dissolve all these different fiber types and turn you into goulash. Now, if you've heard of these enzymes, and you may have done, it's because they are the same enzymes that are released by the so-called flesh-eating bacteria. If you're unlucky enough to be infected by these microbes, they're releasing large amounts of these enzymes very quickly, and they dissolve everything. They dissolve muscle, cartilage, ligaments, and bone. It is those same enzymes being released in much smaller amounts for much longer periods of time that drive the gradual and progressive loss of cartilage or bone that leads to osteoarthritis and osteoporosis, that gradually creates holes in the linings of your arteries, which is the beginning of coronary artery disease, and essential hypertension, which leads to the progressive death of neurons, for example, in the hippocampus and other parts of the brain, that is now identified as a very critical element in the development of many neurodegenerative diseases. Why is all this happening? Well, we're being killed, we're being poisoned by the great food manufacturing companies. These are brands that you know and that you love, and they produce a very wide range of different foods which are not acutely toxic, but in the long term, they are very toxic because this food universe, this post-transitional food universe, has a very high omega-6 to 3 ratio. It's full of soy oil and corn oil. Omega-6s, the omega-3s have gone largely. The polyphenols have gone too. So two of the most important anti-inflammatory nutrients have been disappeared from the diet, and two more have been taken away as well. And I'll talk more about the prebiotics later. So the key four anti-inflammatory macronutrients have gone. They've been replaced by a group of new compounds, which are highly pro-inflammatory. They're produced by modern food production technology. Then it's made worse by putting huge amounts of sugar and starch into these ultra-processed foods, which means you're pouring a large amount of glucose into the bloodstream, creating hypoglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, moving towards insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and all the problems that that creates. And just as you think it's getting over now, the worst is over, well, it's not, because these diets also contain far too much sodium, not enough magnesium and potassium, which makes everything worse. This is a diet which causes chronic inflammatory stress. And because it's so full of empty calories from sugar and from plant oils, at the same time, it causes malnutrition. So this is not classical malnutrition, which is what I was taught in medical school and my medical colleagues are familiar with, which looks like that. It's type B malnutrition, where people have enough and very often too many calories, but they're low in vitamins and minerals and a whole range of phytonutrients and prebiotic fibers and omega-3s, methyl group donors, cyanogens, conditionally essential amino sugars. The list goes on and on and on. And that looks like this. And these young American idiots who are eating a diet of burgers, shakes, and fries have both chronic inflammation and type B malnutrition and dysbiosis, which again we'll come to later, which means they already have in their bodies the seeds of those diseases, those degenerative diseases, which in a few decades' time will come to the surface, make them ill, and then kill them. What's ultra-processed food? Well, the ultra-processed food, the definition is a little bit vague. The NOVA definition is probably most commonly used. And really it means, first of all, these are foods which tend to have 6 or more ingredients. Many of those ingredients you don't know exactly what they are, things like emulsifiers and stabilizers, antioxidants. What are they? They're not traditional foods. But the other aspect of this definition is that when you look at the food, you can't immediately tell what's in it because it's been so processed. And that would include things like Coke and Mountain Dew and all those sugar sweetened beverages, which are just purely empty calories, but candy, ice cream, breakfast cereals in there. And basically these are all the foods that you buy. They're very prepackaged. They typically have a long shelf life, a long life for the packaging, not for you. They taste delicious. And they're made to taste delicious. In fact, they're made to be almost addictive. So we like these foods, we eat too many of them, and they are killing us. First of all, they make us overweight. They don't satiate, and people eat too many of them. So the more you eat, the fatter you get. And that creates this paradox where the people who are the heaviest are actually becoming overweight by consuming large amounts of empty calories. And what it creates is this paradox where the heavier that they are, the worse their nutritional status actually is. And that's one reason why the more of these ultra-processed foods, the more that you die. Every 10% increase in your consumption increases the risk of cancer, type 2 diabetes, early death from all different causes, and it's dose-related. The more of these foods you eat, the more you die. And it increases the rate at which the immune system ages, making you more vulnerable to infection, inflammation, and sepsis. Caveat, that last study is a preclinical study in rats. And guess what? They love these ultra-processed foods just as much as we do. And it makes them sick in just the same way that it makes us sick, which is why life expectancy is falling. In America, life expectancy has been falling for the last 5 years, Britain for the last 4, and that same pattern of falling life expectancy is coming soon to Germany, Ireland, and Finland. Look out, Finland, Poland, and Australia, because these are the countries that are consuming the most ultra-processed foods. In North America, astonishingly, almost 60% of calories are ingested in the form of ultra-processed foods. When I look at what people put into their shopping market trolleys here, it's terrifying. You can exactly see that they're poisoning themselves, and then you look at them and you can see it. Britain's next, the 51st state, and then there you have Ireland, Belgium, Germany, Poland, and Finland. So the same problems are coming to you. And in fact, I think you can already see them in bellwether groups, at-risk groups. How can you make yourself healthier? Well, switch to a Mediterranean diet. That is very, very protective, but we know another diet, which is even more protective, which was consumed in the second half of the 19th century in Britain, known as the mid-Victorian age. People ate fantastically well, had very good health, made possible by two things: the agricultural revolution, and this is a guy called the Marquis Townshend who introduced the system of crop rotation. So agricultural productivity increases dramatically. We have the Industrial Revolution, a transport system bringing all this fresh agricultural produce into the cities where people are working, and they're working with their backs and with their hands. It's a blue-collar society. And when you look at how much physical activity these people were involved in, it's a huge amount. No information technology, no internal combustion engine. They are working between 60 and 75 hours of physical activity every week. Huge amounts of calories to keep that going. Women 3,000 plus, men 4,000 to 7,000. And what are they eating? No ultra-processed foods or basic produce. Lots of omega-3s, not much omega-6, lots of polyphenols. It is a super Mediterranean diet. And when we look at their public health profile, it's very, very different from ours. Look at life expectancy. Mid-Victorian women versus their equivalent today, 21st century working class women. Women have gained 3 years life expectancy, but that's only because of family planning and improved obstetrics. Two medical triumphs of the 20th century. But look at men. Men have actually lost 3 years of life expectancy. And not only have we lost life expectancy, we've lost a lot of health expectancy. Health expectancy describes how many years you can expect to live before your health starts to fail. We can expect to spend the last 10% of our lives, 10 to 11%, in progressive medical decline, becoming progressively more medically dependent. That isn't how it happened in the 19th century. What we know from the records is that the mid-Victorians were physically, intellectually, and sexually completely competent, completely healthy, until right at the end of their lives, when they tended to die very, very quickly, and usually of a fulminating infection. We've looked through thousands of the autopsy reports of that period. Doctors were actually very good at pathological anatomy in that time, because they did so much of it, better than many of my colleagues are today. And what we say is, what we see is very much less chronic degenerative disease. They knew what heart disease, coronary artery disease, or type 2 diabetes or cancer was. They could recognize it at the point of death, but they didn't often see it. Only about 90% of what we see today appears to be necessary. You see, they had a life expectancy similar to ours, but they only had 10% of the degenerative diseases that we do. And that says 90% of the dementia, coronary artery disease, osteoporosis, the list goes on. Only 10% of what we see today is necessary. And that's the 10% that's driven by genetic risk factors. And if you're eating a really healthy diet and living a very healthy lifestyle, as the mid-Victorians did, it is only the people with the major genetic risk factors become ill. Everybody else is protected. Other people have looked at the same data. This is another graph from a different research group, and there on the right you can see that cancers in the bottom and cardiovascular disease, the gray bar immediately above it, account for about 2/3 of all deaths, and that's very typical of what you see in a developed nation today. In the mid-Victorian era, those two causes of death are representing not 66%, but 6%. So let's take a typical 21st century subject, and let's say he's eating a modern ultra-processed diet, which means very high 6:3 ratio, no polyphenols, and therefore too much chronic inflammation, which might appear as an arthritic disorder. It might be a cardiovascular problem. It could be non-alcohol related fatty liver disease, which has become extraordinarily common in these unhealthy times. It could be asthma or chronic obstructive lung disorder. It could be migraine, epilepsy, or a chronic neurodegenerative condition, such as Parkinsonism or Alzheimer's. And all of these diseases have become 10 times more common than they were back in the day. But this gentleman, if he's eating a modern diet, is also eating a diet which contains very little prebiotic fiber, which means that his microbiome in the large intestine is overwhelmingly gram-negative, so that he has chronic inflammatory stress in the intestines, leaky bowel, leaky gut, as you call it, and that causes problems not just in the intestines, but it makes everything else worse elsewhere. So what we do is we give them balance oil, which is this combination of omega-3s and fat-soluble polyphenols. It is highly effective at damping chronic inflammatory stress in almost every part of the body, with the exception of the lower intestines. That we can only address using prebiotic fibers, which turns the microbiome from being dominantly gram-negative to dominantly gram-positive, and switches it from being pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory. So what are the prebiotics? How do they work? Well, they're not food for us. These fibers, we cannot digest them. They pass intact into the large bowel, and they are food for these gram-positive bacteria that live in the large bowel. Those are those little dots in green. They like to eat prebiotic fibers, so they stay in the lumen of the gut and the outer mucosal layer, and they break these prebiotic fibers down into fatty acids, including butyrate, which is highly anti-inflammatory. So this is a very healthy situation. The conversation between the microbiome and our cells, those cells on the bottom, is entirely healthy and positive. The microbes are saying to our cells, do not be inflamed, do not be cancerous. Now you move to an ultra-processed diet, the fibers are gone. The green gram-positive microbes start to disappear. They're replaced by gram-negative species in red. Gram-negative species, many of them like to eat mucin, so they destroy the mucosal layers and they come into direct contact with our cells. And they're gram-negative because they are coated with lipopolysaccharide, which is highly pro-inflammatory. This is a bad situation. The microbiome is now saying to our cells, be very inflamed and be cancerous. And by the way, start to leak as well. This is a very, very unhealthy, but sadly all too typical situation that we see today. So what do? We simply put the right types of prebiotic fibers back into the diet, restore bacterial normality, and recreate an anti-inflammatory microbiome. This is what those prebiotic fibers look like at a molecular level. This is fructooligosaccharide, very small molecules. When the bacteria break them down, technically it's a fermentation, they consume it bit by bit like beads along a string. These are short compounds, short molecules, so the fermentation is rapid. And we add a carefully calculated amount of a longer fiber called inulin, which ferments more slowly. Larger amounts of this molecule, 1316 beta-glucan from oats, slower fermentation, and larger amounts of this, which is a resistant starch or dextrin, which we typically obtain from green banana. Very large molecule, very slow fermentation. You need all of them because once this blend of prebiotics arrives in the large intestine, everything's moving. So the FOS, the very short molecules, start to ferment first, changing the microbiome from gram-negative to positive. And then once they're used up, they're taken over by the inulin, the 1316 beta-glucans, the resistant starch. It's like a relay race. In this way, we transform the microbiome throughout the entire length of the large intestine. And according to the WHO, this should reduce early death by 30% by reducing the risk of those very serious conditions. How much should you eat? According to the WHO, about 30 grams a day, that's where you should start. But if you eat more fiber, you get more protection. Problem, 9 out of 10 people don't eat anywhere near enough fiber. The average intake is only half the WHO suggestion for a minimum intake. And when you break that down, you find only a quarter of it, 3.5 grams, are those all essential prebiotic fibers. So the WHO are really saying you should double that amount, which is what we've done. In fact, we've gone further. in 2 scoops of xenobiotic, you have 12 grams of these prebiotic fibers in this very careful time-release blend, which should be even more protective. There's 2 more sources of chronic inflammatory stress, and you need slightly different tools to address those. And one of those sources is deep adipose tissue, which has a strong tendency to be infiltrated by macrophages. They break the fat down, create inflammatory compounds, and apple obesity, apple type as opposed to pear-shaped, we think of as being more dangerous, probably because these inflammatory mediators are being released very close to the pancreas, the heart, the liver. We'd like to try and stop this inflammation. You can do it by taking a lot of exercise, which is the only way to lose that deep adipose tissue, or you can neutralize it with a group of fat-soluble phytonutrients, which we have collected together and put into another pharmaconutritional tool called Extend, which is designed to do a lot of things, but one of the things it does is to damp that source of chronic inflammatory stress. Leaving only one more to go. And that, of course, is periodontal disease, which every dentist knows about. And if you ever brushed your teeth, spat into the sink, and see a spot of blood, this is what you have. It's a dysbiosis and chronic inflammation in the mouth, which is very close to the brain. And we think that toxins are able to get into the brain through the olfactory nerve. And we believe that is why periodontal disease increases the risk of Alzheimer's, Parkinsonism, and stroke. But of course, you're swallowing these toxins, and that is why we think that this also links to an increased risk of various problems elsewhere in the body. Now, you can treat periodontal disease by going to the dental hygienist and having the roots of your teeth scraped, which is a terrible experience, or you can do it the easy way. We have found an alternative in the ocean, and it's not from the fish this time, it's from the seaweed. Marine seaweeds, when you pick them up out of the ocean, first thing you'll notice is they're slippery. They're coated with non-stick compounds called fucoidans. And if you eat these edible seaweed fucoidans, you absorb them, they get into the bloodstream, into the saliva, they're washing the roots of the teeth with this natural Teflon, this anti-stick substance, and in the next 24 hours after taking them, plaque disappears. And you can test this for yourself using plaque disclosure tablets you can get from your dentist. The gums stop bleeding. 2 or 3 weeks later, the tartar, mineralized plaque, drops off your teeth. And at that point, everything goes back to normal. And some very good Japanese work shows once the inflammation around the roots of the teeth has been resolved, loose teeth start to anchor themselves back into the jaw. Very, very interesting. So we are putting this into a new version of Extend, or possibly a standalone that is designed to address this problem of chronic inflammation in the mouth, and that should remove risk factors for all kinds of other healthcare problems as well. I don't think everybody should take all these supplements. It's not necessary. If you're eating a really good diet, you certainly don't need them. So one of the ways to find out if you could benefit from them is by taking the balance test. It's a self-test, pinprick, drop of blood on a filter paper, goes off to a third-party validated laboratory, and in a couple of weeks, you get a personalized and report telling you exactly whether you have a 6:3 ratio that is good and healthy, or too high and very definitely unhealthy. So this is all the science that really lies behind our very limited offering, a very small portfolio. It's a systems approach to inflammation, type B malnutrition, and dysbiosis. So in most tissues, you can damp chronic inflammatory stress with this combination of omega-3 and polyphenol. In the gut, you can reverse dysbiosis, restore a normal microbiome with this time-release blend of prebiotic fibers. And in deep fat and in the periodontal problem areas, those are something that you can deal with using Extend, which also reverses type B malnutrition. So now we've got to this point where instead of just saying, oh, well, the modern lifestyle is making us healthy, we can be more specific. We can say it's making us unhealthy by causing inflammation, type B malnutrition, and dysbiosis. And now, for the first time, we can actually do something rational and constructive about it. We can damp the inflammation. We can reverse the type B malnutrition. We can reverse the dysbiosis. We've done this for very, very many people. and the results are phenomenal. And it's something that you can explore for yourselves. So let me now stop the screen sharing and hand it over to the moderator, because I hope that there is a little bit of time left for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton. Quite a comprehensive analysis, I may say. We indeed have a couple of questions came from the audience. First one, it seems that the blood testing for analyzing one's nutritional status is becoming more popular for individuals and also for healthcare providers. How do you see this developing globally in the next few years?
I think that it's a very essential part. It's a core element in this movement that we're seeing from nutrition to EBN, evidence-based nutrition. Now, this is what we've seen in medicine. We've moved towards something called EBM, evidence-based medicine, which is an aspiration very often more than a reality. This same thing is happening in nutrition. I'm not saying you should take this because I'm telling you to. No, let's see first of all whether you need an intervention of this sort, and then let's give you the intervention and then look to see whether the needle moves as a result. The important thing to note is that these tests are administered by independent third parties, validated forensic analytical laboratories who are attached to the WHO and associations like that. They do the measuring, so we can be very confident that the measurement is real. And then what we see is once we start to use these tools, people's conditions improve, dramatically. And we can see that that improvement is happening in parallel with the improvements in their lipid profiles or the improvements in their microbiomes, because we're developing a test for microbiomal shift as well. We believe that as we go forwards, this whole area will have to be properly evaluated and demonstrable objectively using either validated components or the use of these types of third-party testing systems. That is the future of nutrition. And that is going to be critical if this type of pharmaconutrition is going to be accepted and integrated into orthodox and conventional medicine, which is where it should be.
Thank you. Next one, now that nutritional profiling is more commonly done with laboratory analysis, how will this affect the whole science of nutrition in the near future?
I think a great deal of traditional nutrition will simply be swept away. I don't have a very high regard for nutritionists, and I don't have a very high regard for the supplement industry, because when you look at a lot of the formulations that they make, it's quite clear they don't know what they're doing. And these supplements are mostly purchased by people who don't know what they're buying. This is a terrible business model. I can't think of any other business in the world that works like that. So we're starting now, finally, to put this onto a solid evidential base. And we're turning nutrition into pharmaconutrition. Now, I'm a clinical pharmacologist. I obsess about the mechanisms of action of foods and food derivatives. And the definition of pharmaconutrition is where you take the pharmacological actions of foods and food derivatives and cross-reference them against the biochemical imbalances and resulting physiological imbalances that we know are at the core of chronic degenerative diseases. This is the only viable approach to dealing with our public health problems, which are largely caused by the fact that we have moved from a traditional diet that we evolved to eat onto this very, very artificial, very dangerous, very toxic, postmodern, ultra-processed diet. If people ate healthily, we would not be necessary, but they don't. What we have produced are the antidotes to the modern ultra-processed diet.
What areas of healthcare and specialist doctors have been the most interested in these themes of pharmaconutrition?
Well, clinical pharmacologists who have the same discipline behind them that I do understand exactly what it is that we're trying to do. The medical statisticians and mediconomists also see the point of what we're doing, because the costs of healthcare are spiraling. As I said at the beginning, these chronic degenerative diseases are becoming not only more frequent, but we're seeing them in younger and younger groups of patients. So the economic impact of this terrible state of public health is absolutely crippling. And as our idiot politicians steer the global economy deeper and deeper into disrepair, our ability to maintain this enormously high cost of medical spending is going to be diminished anyway. We need to find a more cost-effective way of improving public health. And incidentally, it's not only more cost-effective, it's more effective, and it's kinder. Unlike the use of medications to treat these types of conditions, which is a very high-risk strategy, we kill a lot of our patients. This way of treating people with nutrients is very, very safe, extremely safe. So the med-economists are getting very interested in this, partly because the medics in the front line are increasingly seeing people who have been using our healthcare protocol. They're coming on board because they see many of their patients who they have been treating basically in a long, slow decline, because that's all drugs do. They'll simply manage symptoms. They won't slow the course of these diseases. They'll see a patient of theirs becoming medically independent and basically recovering. They'll say, oh, well, that was just one case, doesn't mean anything. And then they see a second and then a third. And then what very often happens is the doctors will then say, maybe there's something here. And they will use the health protocol in a family member, because doctors and their families get sick too. And it might not be the nearest and dearest. It might be an elderly aunt or a third cousin twice removed, someone expendable, and they give them the healthcare protocol. They see them getting better, and then the doctors start treating themselves, because doctors get sick, and many they're just as unhealthy as anybody else. They see the benefits for themselves. They become drug-free, and even although this is not very scientific, they find that very convincing. Now, I don't regard case histories as being particularly persuasive. They're very low levels of evidence, but doctors on the whole aren't scientists. And once they see that they no longer require antihypertensives or a whole range of other types of drugs, they find that convincing, then they join us. And we now have very extensive collaborations with frontline doctors in over 60 countries.
I will give some time to our translator, who is now working with translating this to Finnish. You mentioned xenobiotic testing, gut bacteria testing, but what other areas of nutritional testing do you see as interesting, and what we might be expected to provide in the future?
Well, the microbiomal test is really interesting, and we know it works in the laboratory. What we're doing now is finding ways of automating it, which brings the cost down. Other areas that we would like to test, well, we have a very, very potent and very rapidly acting antidepressant, which also treats anxiety states. And we have developed a test for that, which is a pencil and paper test. It's a combination of stripped down HAM-D and POMS. Those are tests that are very well established in the medical profession. And I think we're going to be rolling that out in association with Viva, which utilizes a validated saffron extract. So with something like Extend, it's more complicated because this is a very complex formulation. It does many different things, and it's very difficult to find a single parameter that would be representative of the impact of the whole. But this general idea of using testing to create a feedback link so that the consumer can see that something is changing in parallel with their improvement in symptoms, I think is really important. And there are breath tests, which are already in quite wide use in the medical profession. There are various tests that can be done transdermally. There are salivary tests, and we're looking at all of those, and we're hoping to integrate more and more of those into our program.
All right. I again take a few second break for our translator before I go further. We have one question here concerning clinical trials. You have mentioned that there is, at least with balance oil, there's one clinical trial going on. Can you reveal something about those projects?
I'll tell you as much as I can. Zinzino is still quite a young company, still a small company. If you look at the big pharmaceutical companies, we're small in comparison. But we are now committed to a program of clinical trials, prospective RCTs. The first one is in the area of essential hypertension, which we think is, most people think is caused by something called endothelial dysfunction, which is a slow subclinical inflammation of the linings of your arterioles. And that's taking place in a center of research excellence in an EU member state. And I think I probably shouldn't say more than that at the moment. It's a very carefully designed study with all of the controls in there that any good clinical scientist would want to see. It is being prepped in a way by another study, which is a pen and paper study. We have a library of 500,000 cell membrane fatty acid profiles. And what we have been able to show is that if you eat a diet, a modern diet, you have a 6:3 ratio of about 15:1 on average. This is throughout Europe. If you eat fish oil, and many people do, that does bring the ratio down a bit, but not by much because omega-3s are simply not very effective. It brings it down to about 10:1, which is somewhat better, but that's still pro-inflammatory. If you eat a seafood diet, that brings it down to 3 or 4:1, which is below the 5:1 threshold, and that's really healthy. That's anti-inflammatory. If you use balance oil, that does the same thing. Balance oil behaves in the same way in the body as eating a seafood, which is why you get the same changes in the body in terms of markers and improvement of symptoms with balance oil as you do with eating seafood. I think this is something that we have the data for now. I'm actually starting to write this up now as a paper, which will probably go into publication before the clinical trial then appears. So it's a taxonomic piece of work which lays the foundations for the subsequent clinical study. Looking forwards, there will be further clinical trials, and we are currently having discussions as to which indications we would like to address next. Now, we know that our approach is having very substantial effects on not just health conditions, but frankly, disease states. And we know that we see extremely positive results when we're dealing with what you call the diseases of civilization. But it creates a quandary. Once we've shown or proved in the context of a clinical trial that we can treat these conditions using these very complex packages of nutrients, at that point, you can't talk about it because those are medical claims. And you can only make a medical claim at the moment under the regulatory system, which is completely out of date, if you have a pharmaceutical license. We're not talking about pharmaceutical products, we're talking about foods or extracts from foods. They are clearly of more therapeutic importance. They move the needle far more than drugs can do. Most drugs only treat symptoms. But because the regulatory system is based in the 19th century, fundamentally speaking, they are not capable of looking at the impact of foods in a productive way. So we can see what we're doing with these kinds of tools, but we cannot talk about it. We cannot tell the truth. And a regulatory system that makes it impossible to tell the truth is a regulatory system that is completely dysfunctional. I envisage in future that the regulatory systems will catch up to this developing science, but they're not there at the moment. And the major stakeholders, the pharmaceutical industry, don't want it to change. So this is a very complex area. And what has become very clear to me and my colleagues is that the obstacles between where we are now and very much better public health and individual health, the obstacles are no longer scientific. They're no longer technical. They're actually regulatory and they're fundamentally political. Those are the problems that we have to deal with next.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clayton. We will let you to continue your hopefully sunny day in Miami Beach. Discussion for the further research will continue. Thank you so much.